ورحمة الله وبركاته. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. الحمد لله رب العالمين. صلى الله وسلم وبارك على نبينا محمد وعلى آله وأصحابه ومن تبعهم بإحسان إلى يوم الدين. أما بعد. جزاكم الله خيرا for the invitation. And this lecture and the upcoming one, inshallah ta'ala, relate, as you have been made aware, to the sunnah of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. And the word sunnah just means regular practice, something that is continuously practiced. And Allah says this about Himself in the Quran, Sunnat Allahi fi alladhina khalaw min qabl. This is the sunnah of Allah in the people that have come before, meaning this is the regular occurrence and regular practice. And the sunnah of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam is his regular practice. And the scholars of hadith use the word sunnah in one way, and the scholars of fiqh use the word sunnah in another way. And this is really important to distinguish between the two. Firstly, what's the job of the scholar of fiqh? The faqih, the jurist. When I say a faqih or a jurist, what's meant by that? That's a question to you.
Someone who decides the law.
Okay, so somebody, a scholar, person of knowledge, whose role is extracting the law from the texts, the Quran and Sunnah, and that which comes from it in terms of evidences, and providing legal solutions, just as a solicitor or a lawyer does, using the law to provide legal solutions. That's the role of the jurist, the faqih, the scholar of fiqh. And what's the role of the muhaddith, the scholar of hadith?
To explain the hadith.
Okay, so perhaps explain, and before that, even before explaining a hadith,
Narrate.
huh?
Narrate.
They're right what?
Narrate the hadith.
Narrate. Okay, narrate these ahadith and distinguish. Huh?
And if to verify the hadith?
Yeah, good. Narrating ahadith and verifying ahadith, whether they are
Authentic.
valid. And what does authentic mean? Authentic means we can safely say that the Prophet ﷺ did indeed say it. Weak means, depending on the level of weakness, means we can't for sure attribute to the Prophet ﷺ. And that's something that needs to be understood as well. Weakness in hadith is levels. It's not all the same level. Some weak ahadith are disputed between the scholars. Some scholars may say, yes, that's an authentic hadith, the Prophet ﷺ did say that. And other scholars will say no. So there are ahadith that we know for sure are from the Prophet ﷺ, or more or less for sure. And then there are ahadith that we know for sure are lies, or fabricated, or very weak, really can't be attributed to the Messenger ﷺ. And in between there are levels. In between there are levels. So, not every hadith that is considered authentic by one person is necessarily authentic according to all the scholars. And not every hadith that is weak is necessarily weak according to all of them. So, when the muhaddith talks about sunnah, he's talking about, did the Prophet ﷺ do this? Did he say this? Was he like this? Did this really happen in his presence? Yes or no? They're not talking to you about halal or haram. They're just passing on the ahadith to you. The role of the faqih, the jurist, then comes in, extracts rules from those ahadith. So when a muhaddith says, from the sunnah of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, it is to stand up at night and pray. Would the scholars of fiqh call that a sunnah as well? In this case, yes, a sunnah. But what does the scholar of fiqh mean? The scholar of fiqh means it's a sunnah, it's not wajib. And the ahkam are 5. Anything in our lives, anything that we do, is either obligatory, wajib, or mustahab, recommended, a sunnah, or mubah, which is, what's mubah? Permissible, something permissible. It's allowed. And in a minute you're going to give me an example of each one. Then we have makruh, which means disliked. And we have haram or muharram, which is prohibited or forbidden. Who can give an example of something wajib, obligatory?
Praying.
The 5 daily prayers. Yeah, the 5 daily prayers. Not just praying, because some prayers are wajib, some prayers are recommended, some prayers are haram. So not every prayer is wajib, but the 5 daily prayers are wajib. What's an example of something that is mustahab, or what the fuqaha would call sunnah? That's another word for sunnah. What's an example?
Sunnah al-Fajr.
طيب, the sunnah of Fajr, the 2 rak'ahs that we pray before Fajr, that's an example of something that is recommended. What's an example of something mubah, permissible? Sorry? Optional prayer we said is recommended, the second category, because you're rewarded for the action. But mubah means what? Means if you do it or you don't do it, there's no reward or sin involved. And in fact, Abdullah ibn Abbas radiallahu anhuma, and a number of scholars say, those things that are mubah don't even come under what's written down on the Day of Judgment. Meaning, what you'll be questioned about on the Day of Judgment is that which relates to obligatory actions, prohibited actions and recommended actions, not that which relates to mubah. Why did you wear sandals on this day? You're not going to be questioned about that. Why did you decide to wear green socks instead of blue ones? You won't be questioned about that on the Day of Judgment. That's what he says, rahimahullah, radiallahu ta'ala an. So what's mubah? Mubah is permissible, and an example of it is, I've given you a clue. Some clues, in fact, already.
Eating fish and biryani before eating fish.
Eating ish? Fish.
Eating biryani.
Eating
before-
fish, eating biryani. Okay. It's mubah. You're not going to get more reward, and you're not going to get less reward. And it's not disliked. The majority of things are mubah. The majority of things are mubah. Allah Ta'ala says, هُوَ الَّذِي خَلَقَ لَكُمْ مَا فِي الْأَرْضِ جَمِيعًا. Allah is the one. He is the one who created for you everything that's on the earth. Foods, drinks, different types of clothing, different types of practices, whatever it is. These things are considered mubah.
So is it include anything in ibadah? So
Sorry?
is it included if we do something like ibadah? Like the Ashaq says that eating biryani is nothing with ibadah, like worship.
Yeah.
So is there any mubah in worship? Like
Nah, that's a good question. Can an act of worship be mubah? The general rule is no, an act of worship can't be mubah. Because if it's an act of worship, it's either obligatory or it's recommended, you're rewarded for it. If it's not obligatory and you're not rewarded for it, then you shouldn't be doing it. It may be a prohibited act of worship. Some acts of worship are prohibited. And some acts of worship are makruh, disliked. Okay, and there are several examples of that. For instance, if a person was to pray 2 rak'ahs, and there's a bit of difference of opinion on this issue, and the majority say if you pray 2 rak'ahs of a nafil prayer after Asr, Imam Ahmad rahimahullah says that's haram, because the Prophet ﷺ prohibited praying nafil at this time. And some of the fuqaha say it's makruh. So these are acts of worship, but they're either makruh or they're haram. And some acts of worship that are innovated, made up, and don't have enough of a basis in the sharia, in the deen, also can be either prohibited and maybe makruh, disliked. So acts of worship as a general rule don't come under mubah. And there are a few exceptions. Some fuqaha have mentioned a few exceptions on mubah, but there's a give and take on that. So mubah is the majority of things. Then we have what is makruh, which is disliked. And an example of something makruh is,
Smoking.
maybe according to some fuqaha, like some of the later Hanabila and some of the later Hanafiya, smoking maybe is makruh, according to a position. Okay, what else? Naam?
garbage.
Eating garlic. Perhaps eating garlic for the one who wants to attend the masjid. Okay. Also, fiddling in salah. Fiddling around in salah with your clothing or with your beard and so on. That's makruh. It's disliked. Now, if a person does these things, is that a good thing? No. Are they sinful? Strictly speaking, they're not sinful. Strictly speaking, you're not sinful for doing something makruh. You're only sinful for two things: leaving a wajib or doing something haram. You're sinful for those two things. What's in between? A person is not sinful for doing or leaving. But the more we come closer to sin, the more likely we are to fall into sin. So that's not to belittle. And once I was in a dars, and maybe I mentioned this previously, even here perhaps. I was in a dars and I was teaching fiqh, and I came to the issue of qaza', which is to shave part of the head, and to leave part of it. And the hadith of Ibn Umar, naha an-Nabiy sallallahu alayhi wa sallam an al-qaza', the Prophet sallallahu alayhi wa sallam prohibited qaza', وهو أن يحلق بعض غلام شعر الغلام وأن يترك بعضه, and it is to shave part of the head and to leave part of it. And the four madhahib and the majority of scholars say doing so is makruh, is disliked. So when I said it's makruh in class, some of the young boys who were attending class started cheering. They were celebrating that it's makruh, because they had similar haircuts, and so they were happy to find out it's not haram, but it's only makruh. And so, okay, that's it could be worse, but makruh doesn't mean recommended. Makruh doesn't mean good. But makruh means, strictly speaking, it's not sinful, but it's something that should be avoided. Okay, so when the fuqaha say this is a sunnah, they're talking about the second category. If you do it, you're rewarded. And if you leave it, then it's no sin. And there is obviously a lot of detail, but that's the case. Now, perhaps what the Shaykh will talk about later, and what we're talking about now, is the sunnah in its general meaning. That doesn't have to be things that are just recommended. It is things that are wajib, things that are recommended, the daily practice of the Prophet ﷺ, the sunnah in its general term, the sunnah of the muhaddithin. And when we talk about people of the past, that's one of the most beneficial things to do. And this is why reading biographies are really useful. Reading biographies are very useful. Any biographies of people who are generally successful and people who generally have benefited human beings, and especially if they have managed to balance between their religion and their personality and their contributions. That's an even better thing to read up on, because it's in our nature that we like to have some sort of role model, someone to look up to. And regardless of the age a person reaches, they always have someone who they look up to, whether alive or dead. And this is especially useful for children, because it is enjoyable as well as beneficial. Biographies and stories are enjoyable as well as beneficial. And from Allah's blessing upon us is that He sent two things. He sent the books and He sent the prophets. He didn't just send books, because the Quran alone, although it is enough, strictly speaking, but because there is no practical example for us to follow in a book, Allah Ta'ala sent the messengers. And that's why the Quran, the book of Allah Ta'ala, and the practice of the Messenger Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam are two things that go hand in hand. They can't be detached from one another. They have to go together. One on its own doesn't suffice, because Allah Subhanahu wa Ta'ala sent the Messenger to explain the Quran. And that's why Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, وَأَنزَلْنَا إِلَيْكَ الذِّكْرَ, and we have sent down to you a dhikr. What's a dhikr? إِنَّا نَحْنُ نَزَّلْنَا الذِّكْرَ, we have sent down the Quran. Dhikr is the Quran. وَأَنزَلْنَا إِلَيْكَ الذِّكْرَ لِتُبَيِّنَ لِلنَّاسِ مَا نُزِّلَ إِلَيْهِمْ, so that you may clarify to the people what has been revealed to them. So the role of the Prophet ﷺ is to provide a practical tafsir of the Quran. Imam Ahmad rahimahullah says, As-sunnatu tafsirul Quran. The sunnah of the Prophet ﷺ is a tafsir of the Quran. It's an interpretation, an explanation of the Quran. And that's why the first step of understanding the Quran is to understand it through the Prophet ﷺ, as well as understanding the Quran through the Quran itself. So that's something really essential to understand. And this is why the scholars rahimahumullah ta'ala took such great care with the sunnah of the Prophet ﷺ. And this is why some scholars memorized hundreds and thousands of ahadith, hundreds and thousands, with their chains of narration. And it's reported that Abu Hatim or Abu Zur'a said to the son of Imam Ahmad, Abdullah, قال إن أباك يحفظ ألف حديث, your father memorizes 1,000 ahadith, which means a million ahadith. And a million ahadith includes the words of the Prophet ﷺ and the Sahaba and those afterwards, and it includes every chain of narration. Every chain of narration. So you might have one hadith, but it comes in through many different routes. So the same statement of the Prophet ﷺ, but many companions narrated it, and many people narrated it from them. The scholars of hadith call each one of those a hadith, even if it's the same statement of the Prophet. Because some people might think a million ahadith, where are these million ahadith? If he memorizes a million, we've only been left with about a couple of thousand. About half of the deen is gone. No, because the word hadith with the scholars of hadith doesn't mean that. It's not restricted like that. It's meant in its vast sense. And Abu Dawood says, I wrote with my own hand 500,000 ahadith. And Al-Bukhari says, I memorized 100,000 authentic ahadith and 200,000 weak ahadith. So these guys memorized huge amounts of ahadith, and they memorized people, narrators. That's quite a boring and tough job, to go around and this person's name is this, when was he born, when did he pass away, etc. All this detail just to make sure no one attributes to the Prophet ﷺ something that's false. Not just false, no one attributes to the Prophet ﷺ mistakenly even. Because the huffaz of hadith, just as they catch out lies, which are easy to catch out, they also catch out mistakes, and that's what's difficult to catch out. Because a scholar can make a mistake as well, a companion can make a mistake as well. So may Allah have mercy on the scholars of, all of the scholars, in particular the scholars of hadith. Because the amount of effort they put in to make sure that our religion doesn't turn like the other religions. To have reports coming in, so and so said this, so and so said this, but we don't know whether this is true or not. And if all of history was to be scrutinized and critiqued the way a hadith of the Prophet ﷺ were critiqued, none of history would still remain. All history would go out the window. Because this concept of chains of narration, isnad, knowing who said what, whether he directly heard from that person or wrote it down, and who took it from him, and who... No one has that system except the Muslims. And if someone claims to have that system elsewhere, then no one has it to such perfection as the Muslims. So that's a big blessing of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Now, today we look at one of these Imams. And this Imam is the Imam of Medina, Malik ibn Anas. His kunya is Abu Abdullah, and his name is Malik ibn Anas ibn Malik ibn Abi Amir ibn Amr ibn al-Harith al-Himyari, and That's because he was originally from Yemen. His family was originally from Yemen and they moved to Medina. And his father's name is Anas ibn Malik. His father's name is Anas ibn Malik. And it's not the companion Anas ibn Malik. It's somebody else. So his father's name is Anas ibn Malik. And Malik rahimahullah was born in the same year that Anas ibn Malik passed away. Anas ibn Malik, the companion. So Anas ibn Malik al-Sahabi, who was the servant of the Prophet ﷺ, and who lived for many years after the Messenger ﷺ, one of the latest companions to pass away. He passed away in the 93rd year after Hijrah. And Malik ibn Anas, the Imam we're talking about today, was born in that same year. And around that area, 93, 94 years after the Hijrah, 95 years after the Hijrah, that year, the 94th year, was called A'am al-Fuqaha, the year of the Fuqaha, the year of the jurists. Because so many of the Fuqaha, the scholars of Medina, passed away in that same year. Including the Imam of the Tabi'een, Sa'id ibn Musayyab. And including Al-Qasim. Al-Qasim was later on, sorry. Al-Qasim passed away 106. But including Kharij ibn Zayd ibn Thabit, another Imam, the son of Zayd ibn Thabit, another great jurist in Medina, passed away in that same year. But his father, the father of Malik ibn Anas, wasn't very well known, and he wasn't known as a scholar. He narrated a few ahadith, but he wasn't very famous. His grandfather was a companion, the grandfather of Malik, whose name is also Malik. We just said Malik ibn Anas ibn Malik. And the grandfather of Malik was one of the 4 people who buried Uthman ibn Affan radiyallahu anhu. So Malik was brought up into a religious family, a righteous family, a family of knowledge. And when he was young, his mother dressed him up and put a turban on him, dressed him up nicely, and told him, go to Rabi'a and study with Rabi'a. So he started seeking knowledge from a young age. And his brother, Malik had a brother called Nadr ibn Anas. And people used to refer to Malik as his brother. If someone is famous, I think of a famous footballer or famous individual, when you talk about their brother, you don't talk about their brother with his name, because no one knows his brother. You say his brother, that guy's brother, so and so footballer's brother, or so and so famous individual's brother. So Malik initially was known as An-Nadr's brother, Akhun Nadr, because no one knew Malik. He was a kid. He wasn't very well known, so people would refer to him as Akhun Nadr, the brother of An-Nadr. And An-Nadr was a bit of a student of knowledge, would sit in the circles of knowledge. Then when Malik became a hard-working student of knowledge, he became the more famous out of the two. So people would refer to his brother An-Nadr as Malik's brother. As Malik's brother, no longer refer to him by his name, but they would refer to him as Malik's brother. And Malik was special in many ways. He initially started studying with Abdurrahman ibn Hurmuz, one of the Imams of Medina. He studied with him for 7 years, and then he moved on and studied with other scholars like Rabi'a and Ibn Shihab al-Zuhri and Nafi' Mawla bin Umar. But there was one incident where Zuhri came to Medina, and Malik was still a young man, in his teens roughly. And Az-Zuhri narrated, Az-Zuhri, by the way, when we say Zuhri, we are talking about someone who is on another league when it comes to narrating hadith and ilm. Very few are matched with Imam Ibn Shihab al-Zuhri. A special personality. So Az-Zuhri came to Malik and Rabi'a ibn Abi Abdurrahman, who was known as Rabi'atul Ra'i, and he narrated to them 40 ahadith. So they said to him, give us more, narrate more ahadith to us, because we want to hear from these ahadith. So he said to him, I've narrated 40 to you. What's the point in narrating more if you're not going to learn them and memorize them? So Rabi'a said to him, amongst us is someone who will narrate back to you exactly what you've just narrated to us. Now. So Zuhri said to him, who is it? قال ابن أبي عامر. He meant Malik, the little boy Malik. So he said, go on then. So Malik narrated 40 ahadith, and Az-Zuhri narrated about 40, just over 40. He narrated every hadith from beginning till end in the same order, with their chains of narration of course, missing one or two. Immediately, all 40. So Az-Zuhri said to him, I didn't know anyone could still memorize like that except me. I thought I was the only one who could memorize that quickly. And this was at a very young age. Now, Malik rahimahullah ta'ala took from Ibn Shihab al-Zuhri, and we have to appreciate that, is Malik ibn Anas far away from the Prophet ﷺ or close? He's relatively very close. Between him and the Prophet ﷺ are only two people, often. Many of the ahadith Malik narrates are from Nafi' Mawla ibn Umar, the servant of Ibn Umar, who narrates it from Abdullah ibn Umar, who narrates it from the Prophet ﷺ. A very short chain, very close to the Prophet ﷺ. And sometimes there may be three. Sometimes there may be three, like Malik, عن الزهري عن ابن المسيب عن أبي هريرة. And still, three people between you and the Prophet ﷺ is very close. So Imam Malik is from the early scholars. Now, one thing that Malik rahimahullah was known for is his exceptional combining between fiqh and hadith. Some scholars are known as scholars of fiqh, exceptional scholars of fiqh, like Abu Hanifa rahimahullah and Nu'man ibn Thabit. They would consider no one to match Abu Hanifa rahimahullah when it came to fiqh. But Abu Hanifa rahimahullah wasn't considered equal to Malik or Ahmad ibn Hanbal when it came to hadith. Malik was considered stronger than him in hadith. So some scholars were considered very strong in their fiqh, and others were considered very strong in their hadith, like Abdurrahman ibn Mahdi and Ali ibn al-Madini and Yahya ibn Ma'in. But they weren't very well known for fiqh. They were imams in hadith. Their word in hadith is final. If they authenticate a hadith, that's final. But in fiqh, they weren't too well known. They weren't people known to give fatwa, rulings and so on. Some scholars were known to be exceptional and leaders in both of those fields. From the few who were like that was Malik ibn Anas. If we talk fiqh, Malik ibn Anas. If we talk hadith, Malik ibn Anas. No distinction. To the extent that it's reported that Muhammad ibn al-Hasan al-Shaybani, who is one of the students of Abu Hanifa rahimahullah, and again one of the oceans of fiqh, Muhammad ibn al-Hasan. Muhammad ibn al-Hasan al-Shaybani studied with Malik. He studied his book Al-Muwatta by Imam Malik rahimahullah, but he was a student of Abu Hanifa. So when Al-Shafi'i and Muhammad ibn al-Hasan had a bit of a discussion, Muhammad ibn al-Hasan is of course sticking up for his teacher, Abu Hanifa. And Al-Shafi'i is backing up his own teacher, Malik, because Al-Shafi'i is one of the students of Malik. And so Abu Hanifa, Muhammad ibn al-Hasan, it seems as though he made a statement to sort of say, our man is given preference. He's a greater jurist, he's a greater faqih. So Al-Shafi'i said, he's a greater faqih out of justice or out of ta'assub, because you're going to just stick to your teacher for the sake of it, or because you genuinely think you have a proof for that. He said, no, we can prove that. So he said to him, I ask you, who is greater in the knowledge of the Quran? Our man or your man? Meaning Malik or Abu Hanifa? So he said, your man. He's great. And Ibn Wahab rahimahullah used to say, كُنَّا نَعْجَبُ مِن نَزْعِ مَالِكٍ مِنَ الْقُرْآنِ. We used to be amazed how Malik extracts from the Quran. Without verses that no one would expect are verses to be used as evidences. Malik would, it's as though the Quran is in front of him, it appears, and he grabs a verse and says, there you go, this verse proves this. He says, كُنَّا نَعْجَبُ مِن Malik. We used to be amazed with Malik. So Shafi'i said to Muhammad, طيب, who is stronger in hadith, our man or your man? And he said, Allahumma sahibukum. He says, it's your man, again. He said, who is more knowledgeable in the knowledge of khilaf between the Sahaba and the narrations from the Sahaba radiallahu anhu? He said, your man again. He said, in that case, nothing's left except qiyas, and qiyas is based on the texts. Qiyas is based on the text. And Allahu alam how authentic this story is, but a number of Imams of hadith reported this incident. And that's not to mean, some people narrate these things to back up their, these are nice stories to show the virtue of some scholars. It does not mean that everything Malik says, if weighed against what Abu Hanifa says, Malik is automatically greater. Nor does it mean that Abu Hanifa rahimahullah wasn't as great a scholar. No, it doesn't mean that. And you'll find every person sticks up for his own teacher more than other people, and his own madhab more than other people. And that's a natural thing, and it shouldn't be taken too seriously. It's not, we don't say it's haram because it's natural. It's natural. If you have spent 10 years with a teacher, you're not going to respect him more than other people. Of course you are. He's your teacher. You've studied with him. Naturally there's a connection, there is a trust, you know more about him. He's more likely to be convincing you than anyone else. That's fine. And so if you see someone who's studied the Hanbali madhab, or the Hanafi madhab, or the Maliki madhab, he's convinced with his views, because he's studied that madhab. When I read the books of the Hanafiya, like the Sharh al-Tahawi by Abu Bakr al-Jassas, or Bada' al-Sana'a by al-Kasani rahimahullah, they have very convincing arguments. They make you want to change your madhab on every mas'ala. Because these are arguments of scholars, not arguments of local imams. These are leading scholars. And if you read the arguments of the Hanbali scholars, you become convinced and you think this is the truth. And if you read the arguments of Malik, you'll become convinced and say this is the truth. And so that's a normal thing. It's not something where we should turn into a battle and think, look, he's not being convinced by my argument, he's rejecting the truth. I've given him a narration of hadith and he's still rejecting. He's not rejecting the truth. He's more convinced by something else. That's it. So it's not a huge fuss, and the scholars rahimahullah disagreed with each other and still respected each other highly. Now, but the followers unfortunately maybe sometimes cause a fuss, who aren't at the same level of scholarship. Malik rahimahullah ta'ala says about himself, I did not give fatwa until 70 scholars of Medina gave me permission to do so and saw that I was qualified to do so. And he says a person should not give fatwa until those who are qualified consider him to be suitable for this job. And he said, I did not give fatwa until I asked Rabi'ah and Yahya bin Sa'id al-Ansari. So one of the students said, what if they said you can't give? What if they said, no, you can't give fatwa, don't give fatwa? Would you still have given rulings? He said, I would never have given rulings. And that's a big lesson. And that shows that knowledge is something that is passed on expert to expert, expert to expert, expert to expert. And you know that a person is qualified or not if he is respected by those same people who are qualified. Once they're respected, you know that that person is a person of knowledge. If 99% of the scholars consider an individual to be useless and not worthy of being listened to, and maybe they're even criticizing him, then that's a clear sign that such a person is in the wrong field. He's in the wrong field. And if a person is respected and quoted by other people of knowledge, and they admit and affirm that he's a hard-working student of knowledge and was a hard-working student of knowledge and continues to be a person of knowledge, and that's an indication that a person is trustworthy. And this is why people would travel from all around the world to Malik, from all around the world, to seek knowledge from Malik, and sometimes just to ask a few questions. And in a hadith reported by Tirmidhi rahimahullah and others, the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam says, يوشك أن يضرب الناس أكباد الإبل في طلب العلم أو طلبا للعلم. You'll find people traveling long distances seeking knowledge. A time will come where people will travel long distances seeking knowledge. فلا يجدون أحدا أو فلا يجدون عالما أعلم من عالم المدينة. And they won't find any person of knowledge who is greater in knowledge than the scholar of Medina. That's the wording of the hadith. And its authenticity is disputed. Sufyan ibn Uyayna and Ibn Jurayj say, Huwa Malik ibn Anas. This hadith is referring to Malik ibn Anas. And on one occasion, someone came to Malik from Andalus, a long distance. Obviously not by plane. This is walking, using animals. So when he arrived, he asked Malik rahimahullah several questions. And for so many of the questions, Malik said, La adri, I don't know. He says, people have sent me from Africa to Medina to ask you questions. They said no one is greater in knowledge than Malik. They sent me to ask a few questions. You're saying, I don't know. If you don't know, who knows? And if I go back to the people, what do I say? Go back all that distance and say what to them? Say he doesn't know. He said, go back to them and say, Malik said, La adri. Go back and say, Malik said, I don't know. He answered some questions, and many he said, I don't know. He left out. And sometimes a person wonders and is amazed and thinks, sometimes a person's graduated from a university in Sharia, and maybe it takes him 20 years to say, I don't know. He seems to know everything. How is this possible? Because people answer with the slightest thing that they heard. A lot of people don't answer based on sound verification that took effort and time and quality research. Not every answer is a well-researched answer. Someone may have read a ruling online once in his life and answered with that. You ask him in the dars, he gives you that answer. There you go. It's an answer. A scholar said it. There you go. Not everything a scholar says is the fatwa that's suitable for this person who's asking. Very often Malik or Ahmad or others did not answer, not because they had no idea at all, but because they weren't content enough with the research that had been done. Don't think they didn't know. They could give you an answer easily. They've memorized the Quran and hundreds of thousands of ahadith. What more do you need to know to answer? If that's not enough to answer a question, what do you need? And this is why many of them reported about Malik and about Ahmad that they used to say, La adri, la jahlan minhum. They used to say, I don't know, not because of ignorance, lakin bi'ilmihim bil khilaf, but because they had knowledge that there's a difference of opinion on the issue. They might have memorized 10 different opinions from Sahaba, and still he won't give you an answer, because I have not verified fully and in a way that I'm content before I can give you a final answer. And so there's a difference between an answer based on quality research and an answer based on, I heard something, there you go. But something important to distinguish between the two things. So Malik rahimahullah was never shy to say, I don't know. And whenever people talk about this quality of saying, I don't know, Malik is always the first example. Because of how he was rahimahullah ta'ala in admitting, I don't know. And look at how people respect Malik, and look at how we are talking about him 1,300 years later. Lectures on him, countries follow his fiqh, the law of countries follow his fiqh. Hundreds and thousands of books have been written about Malik, the man who regularly used to say, I don't know. So answering when you don't know isn't that what raises you, but a person's honesty and sincerity is what raises a person. And when someone says, I don't know, when they do answer you, you're comfortable, he does know what he's talking about, because he's answered. But the one who answers every question, you don't know, is this one of the answers that he's researched well and studied well, or is this one of the answers that he's making up again? So Malik rahimahullah was special when it came to this. طيب. Now, Malik was distinct from many of the other scholars in another way. The way the scholars of hadith used to do, or what they used to do in terms of their studies, they would first seek knowledge in their own land, their own country. They're from Medina, they would seek knowledge from the scholars of Medina first. They're from Mecca, they would first seek knowledge in Mecca. They're from Al-Kufa, they would first seek knowledge in Kufa. Al-Basra, and so on. When they are done with the scholars of their place, they would then start traveling. And traveling to study hadith was considered something that a scholar had to do. Because traveling gives you experience. Traveling teaches you a variety of ilm. And notice how a person, if they only study in one place, they become much more closed off, because their way of thinking is only very limited. But the scholar who's travelled around many places and studied with many different types of scholars, such a person produces quality knowledge and balanced knowledge, along with quality experience. And this is why Shaykh Abdul Fettah Abu Ghudda rahimahullah, one of the contemporary scholars of hadith from Sham, he says, Allah Ta'ala says in the Quran to the bee, he says to the bee, ثُمَّ كُلِي مِن كُلِّ الثَّمَرَاتِ, and eat from all fruits. Then he said, from it comes a shifa. مختلف ألوانه فيه شفاء للناس. A cure of many different colors, or a drink of many different colors that is a cure for people. That's what he says about the bee. So the bee took from all different types of fruits, and what it produced was quality and was a cure for people. He says when the scholar studies with different types of people from different backgrounds and different experiences in different countries, and eats from all of those fruits, the knowledge he produces is quality knowledge, which also produces a cure for people, shifa for people. It's a very nice extraction from the Quran. But Malik was different. Malik didn't travel. Malik stayed in Medina. And his whole life was in Medina. And the only time he left Medina was to perform Hajj. And that's it. And Malik had a position on the fiqh of Medina. He considered the knowledge of the scholars of Medina to be a preference and to be given priority. And they used to belittle the knowledge of these scholars of Iraq and Kufa. And some of them would say to the people of Iraq, the scholars of Medina would say to the people of Iraq, they would say a hadith comes from Medina, Shibran. A hadith comes from Medina, a small narration, small hadith. وَيَعُودُ إِلَيْنَا مِنْكُمْ ذِرَاعًا. And it leaves Medina only a hand's span. But when it comes back from Iraq, suddenly it's an arm's length. And you guys are adding things and making things up. So the scholars of Medina always criticized the scholars of Iraq. Or often, not all the scholars of Iraq of course, but they often did. So Malik saw that the fiqh of Medina was the sunnah. He says because the Prophet ﷺ lived here. And the Sahaba after him lived here. And they practiced Islam here. And that went on next generation. And then the third generation is the generation of Malik. So very little changed in terms of lifestyle, very little change in terms of how the deen is practiced. And that's why it's narrated that Al-Qadi Abu Yusuf, who was the greatest student of Abu Hanifa rahimahullah, he came to Medina and said to him, mentioned the hadith to Rabi' ibn Abi Abdurrahman, and said, someone narrated to me, it was narrated to him that the adhan of the Prophet ﷺ was like this. So Rabi'a said to him, Ya akhi, this is the masjid of the Prophet ﷺ. We make the adhan in it 5 times a day, from the time of the Prophet ﷺ until today. And you come to me with haddathana. And you're telling me I narrated a hadith from so and so and so and so. Forget your narrations. This is the masjid of the Prophet ﷺ right in front of you. The adhan has been made here 5 times a day, from the time of the Prophet ﷺ until today. Do you need a stronger proof than that? So, because of that continued practice and that continued sunnah, Malik saw that what the scholars of Medina agreed upon is to be taken with. And this is something that Shaykh Taqiyuddin ibn Taymiyyah rahimahullah has a whole risala on. Has a whole small book on this issue. The fiqh of Medina, Ahl al-Medina, and its greatness and virtue, even though Ibn Taymiyyah was a Hanbali. Okay, but he strongly praises the madhab of Medina. And Imam Ahmad rahimahullah used to highly respect Malik. And when Ahmad ibn Hanbal was asked, who is greater in hadith, Malik or Sufyan? Sufyan al-Thawri. He said Malik. He said Malik without doubt. And in another report, he was asked several questions. Who is greater from these scholars? And one of them was Malik. He said Malik is greater in everything. Ahmad ibn Hanbal really respected Malik ibn Anas. And this is one of the reasons that he was a faqih, a jurist, and also a person of hadith. He knew the authentic from the weak. طيب, Malik at the same time was a person of iman and taqwa, and a person of wara', and a person of religion. Because knowledge is not just mere information. If we treat knowledge as only information, Islamic knowledge as just information, things will fail, things don't work out. The only reason we are talking about Malik now is because he was a righteous man. And when his sister was asked, what would Malik do in the house? At home, what does he do? قالت كان شغله القرآن. He said all he does is recite Quran. All his recitation is Quran. An Imam of hadith like this, and sometimes hadith can overtake a person. There's so much, the science of hadith is an ocean. It can overtake a person. And it's narrated that some scholars would not do any of the sunnah prayers, or sunan, or even dhikr after salah. They were so occupied with writing and reading and studying, they left everything. And it's reported that some of the scholars after the salam, assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah, assalamu alaikum from salah, stand up immediately and go and carry on their studies. It can overtake a person, but that's not a good thing, by the way. Just because I'm saying this because it's a natural thing to sometimes be overtaken. You're so occupied. But the quality scholars balanced between worship and ilm. Those who took that on the route of worship only, that's between them and Allah. Their reward is with Allah. They haven't their benefit is limited because they've just focused on worship. And those people who focus on just knowledge, their knowledge is appreciated, but their knowledge is always going to be restricted. Because ilm is information that you take from people and from books, and ilm is also taqwa. And Allah Ta'ala says, Ya ayyuha alladhina amanu, in tattaqullaha yaj'al lakum furqana wa yukaffir ankum sayyi'atikum. O you who believe, if you have taqwa of Allah, if you're conscious of Allah in your actions, in everything that you do and say, and see and hear, if you're conscious of Allah and aware of Allah, yaj'al lakum furqanan, He'll create for you a guiding light that helps you to distinguish between truth and falsehood. And so a lot of the time knowledge comes with worship, and knowledge comes with repentance, and knowledge comes with keeping away from sins. And that's why when Imam Malik saw his saw Shafi'i as a young man, and like I said, the Shafi'i was one of his students. He said to him, Ya bunay, my son, I see that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has put in your heart knowledge. He's put in your heart the light of knowledge. فَلَا تُطْفِئْهُ بِظُلْمَةِ الْمَعْصِيَةِ. So don't turn that light out with the darkness of sin. So he advised him, keep away from sins, so that Allah doesn't take away that knowledge that He's blessed you with. طيب, now, the books of hadith are many. And what's the famous book of hadith authored by Malik ibn Anas? The Muwatta. It's called Al-Muwatta. And there are many books of hadith. When we say the 6 Al-Ummat al-Sitta, for example, Kutub al-Sitta, what are we referring to? Which 6 books of hadith are we referring to? Sahih Bukhari, Sahih Muslim, Sunan al-Tirmidhi, Sunan Abi Dawud, Sunan Nasa'i, and that's 5, there's one more? La. Sunan Ibn Majah. Sunan Ibn Majah. That's the classical definition, or that's the classical numbering. Some scholars replaced Sunan Ibn Majah with the Muwatta of Malik. And that should be the case. Because the Muwatta of Malik is far more authentic than Sunan of Ibn Majah, number 1. And the Muwatta of Malik is from a greater scholar, without doubt, Malik. And the Muwatta of Malik is a book of fiqh, quality fiqh as well. And this is why many of the scholars say, if a hadith is in Sahih al-Bukhari, or Sahih Muslim, or the Muwatta of Malik, then it's authentic. If it's in Sahih al-Bukhari, or Sahih Muslim, or the Muwatta of Malik, then it's authentic. And this is why Shafi'i rahimahullah said, there is no book after the Quran more authentic than the Muwatta of Malik. And there are few ahadith in the Muwatta of Malik that the scholars considered weak. Maybe a handful, literally a handful. Maybe 2 or 3 only. Or a handful, with some khilaf on some of them. So the Muwatta of Malik is a quality book. But because Malik's Muwatta is the root of most of the ahadith of the 6, they didn't include it in the 6. Those who didn't include it, didn't include it. Because if you find the hadith al-Bukhari, many of the hadith al-Bukhari are from Muwatta anyway. They're through Malik. His isnad is through Malik. Very often al-Bukhari narrates from one person, from Malik. And Ahmad ibn Hanbal narrates often from Malik. Abu Dawood's isnad goes up through Malik as well. Muslim's isnad goes through Malik. And so the book of Malik al-Muwatta is a special book. It is the well, of course, when a Shafi'i says this is the most authentic book after the Quran, that's because the Shafi'i came early. He came before Al-Bukhari, he came before Muslim. But one of the special things about the Muwatta of Malik is that it's, like I said, its isnad is very short. Very short chain of narration. So you don't have to worry that much about authenticity, because the chains are so short and all the narrators are often very well known. Also, when it comes to the Muwatta of Malik, as well as narrating hadith, he would also narrate from Sahaba and Tabi'een. And therefore a person understands how the companions practiced the deen and how the Tabi'een practiced the deen. Because Islam is practice, Islam is not words. Islam is not narrations. If Islam was just narrations, that means Islam is just a story. We're here to live Islam, not to tell stories. So the Sunnah needs to be taught in a practical way. And that's what made the Muwatta of Malik so special. Because he gave you the hadith of the Prophet ﷺ, and he gave you the practice of the Sahaba, Tabi'een, and the scholars of Medina. And from the other things about the Muwatta of Malik, rahimahullah ta'ala, is that the Muwatta of Malik became widespread many people narrated the Muwatta. Al-Shafi'i narrated the Muwatta. Muhammad ibn Hassan narrated the Muwatta. Abu Mus'ab al-Zuhri narrated the Muwatta. Yahya bin Yahya al-Laythi narrated the Muwatta. Yahya bin Yahya al-Tamimi narrated the Muwatta. Hundreds of scholars narrated the Muwatta from Imam Malik. It became such an authentic and well-known book, it spread around the whole world. And this is why, and this is how, or one of the ways, the fiqh of Malik was taken over to Egypt and Africa and North Africa and Andalus. And until this day, the madhab of North Africa, Algeria, Morocco, Tunisia, Libya, Mauritania, West Africa, Sudan, the fiqh and the madhab of those countries is the fiqh of Malik. And they go according to the Maliki madhab. And the countries run according to the Maliki madhab on religious issues. According to the Maliki madhab. So the fiqh of Malik became widespread. And for a short phase, the fiqh of Malik was the fiqh of Medina. But then Medina changed afterwards, and no longer did it go by the madhab of Malik. And of course now the widespread madhab in Medina and Mecca is the madhab of the Hanabil. But the madhab of Malik was a very widespread madhab. And many scholars wrote commentaries on the Muwatta of Malik. From them is Al-Hafidh Abu Umar ibn Abdul Barr, rahimahullah ta'ala, the Hafidh of Andalus, the Imam of Andalus. And he was alive at the same time as Abu Muhammad ibn Hazm al-Andalusi, the well-known Zahidi scholar. And also Abu al-Walid al-Baji, rahimahullah, from the Imams of Andalus. And al-Baji had a bit of a back and forth with Ibn Hazm, because Ibn Hazm was strict, and he was a stern person and had a strong tongue. And sometimes he was strict against the madhab of Malik, especially because that was the madhab of his people. And so many people criticized him, and rebuttals were going back and forths. From them was Abu al-Walid al-Baji, and from them was al-Qadi Abu Bakr ibn al-Arabi, who wrote refutations also against Ibn Hazm. And these were rebuttals that were academic rebuttals. They weren't rebuttals that stemmed from hatred or no. These were academic rebuttals, and that's fine. And that shows that the people should. Ibn Abdul Barr, for example, was a great muhaddith, but he was upon the madhab of Malik because that was the madhab of his land. People should stick to the fiqh of their land. They shouldn't oppose it. People should not oppose the fiqh of the land that they're in. You might learn something that is new, and you think, oh, this is sunnah, so I'm going to force it upon people. People don't act upon this. People don't act upon this. You might think it's a sunnah. The scholars that they're going by don't believe it's a sunnah. And it is better for a person to keep people together than to come out with his own opinions. And at the end of the day, your opinion is not wahi from Allah Ta'ala. Allah is not revealing to you knowledge. All you're doing is what everyone else is doing. And if anything, the scholars that they're following are greater than you. And that's something that needs to be kept in mind. And some people come, for example, from a Hanafi background. So they insist on opposing the Hanafi madhab. There's no need to do that. There's no need to do that. Do you have to practice the Hanafi madhab? No, you don't. Do you have to practice one particular madhab? No, you don't. And the four madhab have explicitly said this. The Hanabila, the Shafi'iyya have explicitly said it's not obligatory to follow one madhab, but stick to that madhab for everything. And this is the madhab of the Hanabila, they explicitly say this, and other Imams. You don't have to. But for the sake of order, and for the sake of structure, and for the sake of the majority of Muslims, who don't give a biscuit about this scholar said this, that scholar said this is his proof, that's his proof. They just want to worship Allah normally. I just want to pray, ya akhi. What's all this that you're bringing to me? Is he required to go into the details that scholars are going into? No, he's not required. He's not required to go into that. And so, this is why it's always good to not cause a fuss for people. And this is why Abdullah ibn Mas'ud when he was with Uthman ibn Affan radiallahu anhu in Hajj. Uthman ibn Affan prayed 4 rak'ahs. And Ibn Mas'ud was of the opinion that the sunnah is you pray 2 rak'ahs. He says the sunnah and what you're doing is wrong. Ibn Mas'ud is saying to Uthman, what you're doing is wrong. But Uthman was the Khalifa and people followed Uthman. So when Ibn Mas'ud came to pray behind Uthman, how many rak'ahs did he pray? 4 rak'ahs with Uthman. So people said to him, he'd just been having a go at him for God knows how long, and now you're praying behind him 4 rak'ahs. قال الخلاف الشر, because differing and dispute is evil. Dispute is a greater evil. And people have to distinguish between things that are absolutely false, that we can't accept, and between things that I disagree with, but there is some scope. If we remember this, then we've taken away gold. Some things that people do, I disagree with, or you disagree with. But what they are doing, there is some scope for accepting. For example, I'm from a Hanafi, but I'm not. But if I was from a Hanafi background, and my family in their salah are not raising their hands, they're not raising their hands in salah, I consider raising the hands in salah to be a sunnah. They're not raising their hands in salah. Is their salah valid? Yes, it's valid. Are they following reliable scholars? Yes, they are. Are they following Sahaba? Yes, they are. Sahaba. They're following companions. Companions radiallahu anhu who didn't raise their hands in salah, like Ibn Mas'ud and Umar and others. Do I then have to make a fuss out of it? No, I don't. No, I don't. I don't have to make a fuss out of it. But if something is completely prohibited, we are talking about a major sin, or we're talking about something that is unacceptable according to any person, regardless of which scholar or school you follow, here I have a role to change things in a wise way, of course, not in an aggressive way, but in a wise way. Now my role comes in. Some people are causing so much of a burden for their families on things that are small, like the issue of how to raise the hands or where to place the hands, below the navel or above the navel. Place your hands to the side even, and your salah is valid. So this is not worth making a fight over. But if it comes to things that are clear-cut, prohibited, here my role is to now try to make change. Why am I leaving things that are major sins and I'm focusing on small things? This is why, don't be surprised when your family is hating you and rejecting you and kicking you out and call you names and so on, because the way you're trying to give da'wah, as you claim, is wrong. All of us ought to keep this in mind. There are things that are clearly wrong, and if I'm not sure, I have to learn and find out. And there are things where I can ignore and give people scope. And generally, if you're following one of the four madhahib, there is scope. There is scope on those things. It's not something to make a huge thing about. And this is why one of the leaders said to Malik, he said to him, "You're the most knowledgeable person on the face of the earth." He said, "No, well, you're exaggerating." And he said some things like that. He said to him, "You are, and you know that you are, and I want to collect all of your ahadith and all of your opinions and make it the law that every Muslim on the face of the earth has to follow. Every Muslim has to follow Malik ibn Anas." So what did Malik say? He didn't say to him, "Yes, of course, because I'm following the Sunnah and my opinions are based on Quran and Sunnah, so you have to follow, because it's not my opinion, it's Quran and Sunnah. The whole world has to follow." No. He said, the companions of the Prophet ﷺ went around the world. Some went to Sham, some went to Kufa, some went to Iraq, some went to Mecca, other places. And all of them took with them knowledge. And I have the knowledge of the scholars of Medina. And there may be knowledge elsewhere that I have no knowledge of. So don't force my one opinion on the whole world. So Malik was a long-sighted person. He saw that it didn't make sense to enforce one thing on the whole world. This is from the quality of his understanding, rahimahullah ta'ala. Now, there's plenty that we can say about Malik ibn Anas, rahimahullah ta'ala. And I'll end with some of the famous opinions that Malik ibn Anas had in which he disagreed with the other schools. One of the famous opinions that he had, rahimahullah, is that the dog is pure. According to Malik, the dog, its saliva and so on, is tahir, it's pure. Unlike the other three Imams, the Hanafi madhab and the Shafi'i and the Hanbali madhab, according to Imam Malik, the dog is tahir. Because Ibn Abbas radiallahu anhu reports that dogs used to walk around in the masjid in the Prophet ﷺ's time, and no one would say anything. And if they were impure, then they would have washed the impurities, the saliva and so on. And in one narration, وَتَبُولُ, they used to urinate in the masjid even. And they wouldn't say anything. And this is reported by Al-Bukhari rahimahullah. And also Malik says, Allah Ta'ala allowed us to use dogs for hunting. If a dog is taking things with it, what's a person, does that mean a person has to wear a glove to hold that thing and then put it? He said no. He said the fact that dogs were permitted to use for hunting shows that they're pure. There's nothing on its impurity. And just because you have to wash something, because the hadith of إِذَا وَلَغَ الْكَلْبُ فِي الْإِنَاءِ فَاغْسِلُوهُ سَبْعًا وَعَفِّرُوهُ الثَّامِنَةَ بِالتُّرَابِ, if a dog drinks from a vessel, then wash it 7 times and the 8th one is soil. He says that's fine. Washing it doesn't mean it's impure. If you have saliva on your shirt, you just walk around like that and leave it, or you'd wash it? You'd get rid of it and clean it. Is saliva impure? Human saliva? Human saliva is pure. Sweat, if you're pouring with sweat, again, you get rid of it. It doesn't mean that it's an impurity. So this is one of the positions of Malik that's well known. Another position of Malik that the other three Imams disagreed with is that the menstruating woman is allowed to recite Qur'an. The Hanafi madhab and Shafi'i madhab and Hanbali madhab say that it's prohibited for a menstruating woman to recite the Qur'an. And according to Malik, he says there's nothing to prove that. There's nothing substantial to prove it, according to his position. And so with Malik, for a woman to recite the Qur'an on her cycle is permissible. Recite loudly or quietly, pronouncing the letters or not pronouncing, all of that is permissible, so long as she doesn't touch the mushaf. Because the four madahibs say touching the mushaf has to be with wudu. So that's another one of the positions of Malik. And there is plenty to say about this Imam. And it's worth going away and learning about these scholars. Learning about these scholars. Learning about Malik, learning about Ahmad, learning about Abu Hanifa, learning about the companions before them and the tabi'een. Because it really increases in Iman. And it pushes the person to follow in their footsteps. And perhaps I've taken a bit long. I don't usually like to talk for a whole hour, and I've spoken for a bit more than an hour. But I mean, you can blame the brothers. They arranged for the dust to start this early. But hopefully we took away some useful things from this Imam rahimahullah ta'ala. Sallallahu ala nabiyyina Muhammad wa ala alihi wa sahbihi ajma'in. If someone has a comment or something you want to add, you're welcome to do so. Otherwise we'll get ready for Salah. Jazakumullah khair.